Okay, let's get started, and I want to come back briefly to apocalyptic literature, of which the Book of Daniel is usually considered an example. At least the second part of it clearly fits into that category. And since the early Christian movement often is described in terms of apocalyptic, expectation of the end of the world, imminent end to human history, the kinds of language and imagery and interests that are typically associated with apocalyptic literature. I want to make sure we touch on this, and then we'll move on to the world in which Christianity originated. I won't say too much about the Greco-Roman context. We'll focus more on the Jewish context, which most directly affected the rise of Christianity, which emerges in a Jewish context. But that distinction should not be exaggerated, right? Some of the Greek thinkers that were mentioned, right, Socrates and Plato, very influential, and we see not only the influence of their thought and their ideas in the New Testament, but we see even implicit comparisons being made, for instance, between Paul proclaiming his message in Athens in Acts 17 and things that were connected with Socrates and the stories about his activity in Athens, right? And so the idea that there is, a distinction that can be clearly made between Judaism on the one hand, Hellenism on the other, is at best an oversimplification, right? And as we'll see, even the Hasmoneans, right, the dynasty that descended from the Maccabees and who made the defense of Judaism their rallying cry, often had Greek names, often shared in a world of Greek ideas. There's no way that somebody can simply opt out of a cultural context into which they are born and within which they grow up. And so certainly it is possible to make observations about ways in which Jews tended to be distinctive in the wider Greco-Roman context, but there's interaction and there's influence as well. So I won't say too much about apocalyptic literature. I'll just give a broad overview of some of the key features that tend to be associated with it. And one of the things that was mentioned last time is that with one possible exception, namely the book of Revelation, even that's less than clear, but that seems to have been written by somebody who is known to its recipients. For the most part, though, apocalyptic literature tends to be pseudepigraphal. Right? And I'll write that word up in case you're not familiar with it. Pseudepigraphy, pseudepigraphal, right, means writing under a false name or writing under somebody else's name. And we mentioned last time that most commentators think that that's what we're dealing with in the book of Daniel. Some other characteristics of apocalyptic literature usually claims to reveal something. And in fact, anyone know what, we use the word apocalyptic as in, having to do with the end of the world, and that's pretty much what it means nowadays in English, right? Imminent disaster. Anyone know where the word apocalypse comes from? Anyone see a Bible in which one of the books actually is called the Apocalypse? Yeah, Revelation. I'm really fussy about that because my wife got me a tie that has all the books of the Bible on it, and I thought I could wear this to Biblical Studies Conference, but it says Revelations. Biblical scholars would laugh at me if they spotted that. So it is the book of Revelation, and sometimes it is called the Apocalypse of John, because apocalypsis is the Greek word that means revelation, unveiling, disclosure. And so really when we say that something is apocalyptic literature, kind of what we're saying is something no more than that it seems to be the same kind of literature that the book of Revelation is. But they tend to claim to reveal something, often something about future events, or at least present events under the guise of talking about future events. Sometimes more focus on heavenly realities and things of that sort. Claim to revelation. Right? Oftentimes the author has claims to have had a heavenly journey, or at least to have experienced visions of things going on in the heavens. And those are couched in symbolic language, which often calls for interpretation. And so usually it's an angel, but even when an angel doesn't feature prominently, some sort of figure who guides the visionary on his journey, explains what he's seeing, and so some kind of angelic commentator. Symbolism is a major feature, and you probably picked that up in looking at the book of Daniel. You'll sometimes hear people talk about taking the Bible literally. It's not a concept that we've talked about too much this semester. When it's applied to things like Daniel or the book of Revelation, you should certainly be suspicious of those claims, right? When we get to the book of Revelation, right, it talks about the beast. Not only is it generally taken for granted that the beast is not literally a strange creature, but is symbolic of some human ruler, but the book says as much, right? And so apocalyptic literature not only contains things that seem to be symbolism, but oftentimes is explicit in offering interpretation of the symbolism. So the creatures that you saw represent kingdoms, and then this represents that, this represents it. So there's a lot of symbolism, which is actually interpreted and identified as symbolism in the text itself. In general, right, there's a tendency for apocalyptic literature to regard the present political system, whoever is currently in charge, as an incarnation of evil, as demonic, as in cahoots with diabolical forces, as evil. And oftentimes that's because of an experience of persecution, right, in the immediate context. Right? There's some debate about how to interpret the language of an imminent end that one finds in apocalyptic literature. Certainly, reading the book of Daniel, it seems like after the Maccabean crisis, it was expected that then you have the final judgment. If you read the book of Revelation, there seems to be judgment poured out on Rome, and then the final judgment. And so, in all of this kind of literature, there's a tendency to see a present crisis as leading up to something much more major and dramatic, right? Divine intervention in history. And it's at least spoken of as though it's bringing human history to a close. And since we've talked about symbolism and literalism, there's some debate about whether that language should be taken literally. If so, it seems like apocalypses are always wrong if you take it in a literal fashion. And so the fact that people keep writing this kind of literature and it keeps being appreciated perhaps suggests that maybe that's maybe the problem is how they're being interpreted rather than something else. But certainly expectation of an imminent end or an imminent change, the dawning of the kingdom of God, very common in this kind of literature, tends to be at least implicitly deterministic or fatalistic in the sense that it seems as though, or can give the impression as though, history is following a predetermined pattern and is moving towards a predetermined end, which might seem to leave less room for human freedom. Again, whether that is the right impression or not is something we can talk more about, particularly when we look at a more famous example of apocalyptic literature, the book of Revelation, which we'll be featuring at the end of the semester, not surprisingly, since it kind of wraps things up nicely, as also at the end of the New Testament. And dualism. Right? Apocalyptic literature first appears in Judaism after they've been in contact with Persia, right, and ruled over by the Persians. Anyone know what the main dominant religious tradition in Persia, ancient Persia, was? Known as Zoroastrianism. Anyone at least heard of Zoroastrianism? Some of you, yeah. Pardon? What was that? Go on, no, say it.
I almost said it.
Yeah.
I almost guessed that.
And there's a funny history of the world written with answers that were that included large or small errors on the part of students, but made up entirely of stuff taken from student papers. Not the best of student papers, which is what I've come to expect from you, but some less accurate student opinion. But one really funny example is that somebody once said on exam that Zoroastrianism was founded by Zorro. And that was probably because the person had misheard something which actually is an important feature, right? Wrote that it was a dualist religion. But in fact, it is dualist, right? And so it has nothing to do with duels and nothing to do with Zorro. And for what it's worth, right, not that far off, right? The founder, Zoroaster, or sometimes referred to as Zarathustra. And you may know some music that features that name, right, or other literature. But it is not dualist, but it is dualist, right? And it's easy to mishear that. Right? Posits two eternal forces of good versus evil, light versus darkness, that fight against one another. And it's in the period of interaction with and influenced by Persian ideas that we get the rise of figures like Satan in the full-fledged form of a rebellious angel, powers of good versus powers of evil fighting each other in the heavenly realms. But I put dualism in quotation marks because, at least in theory, within a Jewish and later a Christian context, the dualism, right, the battle of good versus evil, is always qualified by some kind of adherence to monotheism. So the belief that God is ultimately in control and sovereign, which still leaves one puzzled by why history unfolds as it does. But there's a qualified dualism, right, when we find it in things like apocalyptic literature from Judaism and Christianity. There is a cosmic battle depicted between good versus evil, but there's also the conviction that ultimately God is in control and will win out in the end. So there are some key features of apocalyptic literature, and as I said, we'll look more at apocalyptic literature when we get to the book of Revelation. Thoughts, comments, questions, predictions of imminent disaster? Okay. And this is a natural topic to talk about today because in addition to being something that appears in the Hebrew Bible, also a common form of literature in and around this period, and influential on the emergence of Christianity. And I just want to say some key things about what I think are some highlights of the kinds of things that are important to know about the world in which Christianity originated. And among those, I want to mention that by the time we get to around the turn of the Common Era, this is sometimes referred to, the time of the emergence of Christianity, we're in much better shape in terms of our archaeological knowledge than we have been up till now, because as you get closer to our time, right, less time has passed, more artifacts and things have survived. And I want to mention a city which you've probably never heard of. Anyone here actually ever heard of Sepphoris? It was the capital of Galilee until Tiberias was built in the year 19, right? And so during the early years of Jesus, if our dating of his birth is correct, described as the jewel of Galilee, major city, a lot of Hellenistic influence, right? Had a theater that could seat 15,000 people. It's a place where Jewish and Greco-Roman life intersected. We have art, mosaics, things that have survived from frescoes and other things in the city. Nazareth was 3.5 miles away. And so it was walking distance by ancient standards, right? People from Nazareth would inevitably have gone up to Sepphoris for work, for the purpose of selling produce if they were farmers, and so on and so forth. This mosaic has become widely circulated, sometimes referred to as the Mona Lisa of Sepphoris, although her smile doesn't quite live up to the other Mona Lisa. I thought I'd also share some images from Capernaum. That is a city that, if you read the New Testament, is familiar, right? And I'm sharing all of this because there's a tendency to think of Galilee as a rural backwater. And of course, if you're only thinking of it in terms of distance from Jerusalem, then perhaps there's something to that. Right? Certainly further away from the center of Jewish life in Jerusalem. But in fact, there's a lot more to it. Right? That picture of Galilee is rural and far away from where things are really happening is at best one-sided and at worst hopelessly wrong. And these last images are of a large synagogue from Capernaum. This actual structure is from later than the time of Jesus, but seems to have been built on top of the site of an earlier synagogue. And the fact that you have a synagogue of this size being constructed there within a couple of centuries after the time of the emergence of Christianity indicates that there's a significant Jewish population and wealth and organization there, right? And so Jesus lived not far from the largest and most important city in Galilee, and so the assumption that Jesus, his family, his first followers would have been rural country folk or something like that in an isolated backwater is being challenged by archaeology. Bethsaida, another site that's mentioned in the New Testament, was a major fishing village, fishing city, right? A home of a significant fishing industry. And so talking about it as a village is one of the slips that we often make, wrongly so. Yeah. And so he was not a hick from the sticks, if that terminology means anything to you. Talking about it as suburbs, though, like suburbs of Sepphoris, would also give the wrong impression because cities in the ancient world did not have suburbs where wealthy people lived to get away from the city, right? And so was from a village, but one that was closely located, in the vicinity of a major urban center. Right? And that raises some questions. Right? Could Jesus or his disciples have known any Greek? Could they have interacted with other ideas? Could they have gone to the theater? Not something that people always ask themselves about Jesus and his early followers. What opportunities were there to interact with broader cultural context? There's a lot of information online connected with the archaeology of Sepphoris, for instance. The dig itself, right? The excavation work has its own website. And there's a lot of other information, which I don't think I'll actually have us watch this video. But another thing that we need to mention is that increasingly as we get into New Testament times, we're dealing with a time period in which we can also turn to actual texts that have survived that talk about events. So not just archaeology, not just inscriptions, but historians writing about the period in question. And one famous example, and perhaps I should say infamous example, is the mention of Jesus in the Antiquities of Flavius Josephus, Jewish historian, who lived through the Jewish War and wrote a history of it, but also wrote a larger scale history of the Jewish people. And on the one hand, there's a mention of Jesus. On the other hand, there are some things that are in there that seem to clearly indicate that Christians were involved in writing that. And there's no evidence that Josephus was a Christian. And early Christian authors who mentioned Josephus mentioned that he wasn't a Christian. And so it seems clear that there's been some tampering. And that's very unfortunate because had we not had any Christian tampering with this reference, it might have given historians a very clear reference from outside of Christianity, right, from non-Christian sources, to Jesus. Because there's been some tampering, there's some question as to whether there was any mention of Jesus there at all. The majority scholarly opinion seems to be, at present, that there was, in fact, a reference to Jesus, and what happened is that Christian scribes who copied it felt it wasn't laudatory enough, wasn't complimentary enough, and so added some expressions of Christian faith in there. That's a topic that you can find lots of information on online. And on YouTube, we won't watch it today, but there is a brief clip with famous scholar Geza Vermesh talking about. And so if you're interested in watching that, you can go away and find it. I realize we're doing a whirlwind tour, but we are talking about, well, in theory, the whole world, but actually we're constraining ourselves to the context, right, the part of the world in which Christianity emerges. But there's still a lot that we could say, right? There are a lot of details we could go into. And so this is a get us through some background information fast kind of day so that we can get on to the New Testament and not spend more time on background and less on New Testament, right? Any questions, comments so far? If in my speed I am being unclear, stop me or ask questions. Okay. Was that a question?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, like, what would be a reason why historians would want to know, like, if Jesus went to Sephora, like, or if he, I mean, I just don't know what information
Yeah.
behind that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have very little information about Nazareth. In fact, we have so little archaeologically or in terms of reference to it that it's possible, to even question whether there was a village there in the time of Jesus. We just don't have substantial evidence. But what we do know of the region suggests that the village would have been predominantly Jewish, if not entirely Jewish. And so it's really a question of would he have grown up in a Jewish Aramaic-speaking family? Would he have possibly, for reasons of work, gone with other members of his family to Sepphoris and perhaps have learned at least enough Greek to engage in trade and things like that? Would there have been opportunity for him to be to encounter Greek philosophy and other things that in his village might not be talked about in the same way? And so it's really a question of the context of Jesus' upbringing and influences and things of that sort. As we look at the Gospels, we can talk more about some of these subjects. One thing that's noteworthy is, one reason why many of you, in fact, everyone, I think, was unanimous that no one had heard of Sepphoris before today. And one thing that might explain that is that even if you've read the New Testament, it's not mentioned in there. Right? And that in itself is interesting. What does that tell us about the aims of Jesus and his public ministry? Does it tell us something that major urban centers that are much more Greco-Roman, much more cosmopolitan, are not where he centers his activity? Right? It's much more in Jewish towns with predominantly Jewish population. That, too, might tell us something about Jesus and his aims and things of that sort. So, sure. Okay, let me say just a little about first century Judaism. And some of this will overlap at least a little bit with the presentation, which means I can just move more quickly. Right? Who were the Pharisees? What does Pharisee bring to mind? Anyone here ever been called a Pharisee or called somebody else a Pharisee? Heard somebody call somebody else a Pharisee? Or, what does it mean when it's used in that kind of way in modern English? What kinds of things come to mind, if anything? A course like this should be broadening your palette of insults that you can use, right? And so hopefully you're taking advantage of this. Yeah.
I think that was
And that's, I'll bet if you were to look up in an English language dictionary, Pharisee, you might find something like, hypocrite, hypocritical, even before it mentions, also the name of a Jewish group or movement from the first century. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, there are these woes pronounced by Jesus in the New Testament. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. What's important to note is that that's not what the term actually means. And that probably shouldn't surprise anyone. Right? There are all kinds of labels that get attached to religious groups and movements. Not all of them are chosen by themselves. Right? You will not find a church billboard anywhere, I suspect, although I might be wrong about this, that is like, First Church of the Hypocrites. or something of that sort. Right? You probably, there are other terms which, sometimes are self-chosen, or which, even if they're nicknames that are given by outsiders, sometimes find, you know what, we can give a positive spin to that. Right? Pharisee means one who's separated. And probably the closest English word to Pharisee might be something like separatist. I've never come across a church sign that said First Church of the Separatists either. Right? Although there are some that might, the description might fit even if that's not the name. And it sounds like probably this was a nickname that was placed on others by those who didn't like them. And in fact, we have individuals mentioned as Pharisees in the New Testament who are referred to in later rabbinic sources as well as positive figures. And yet those later rabbinic sources don't call them Pharisees, they call them sages. But they do refer to others as Pharisees, and usually poking fun at them in extremes of, for instance, the caricatured as being so concerned to avoid looking lustfully at a woman that they walk around with their eyes closed and bang into doors and things of that sort. Seems like it was originally a nickname or a label placed on by others, but seems to at least have been somewhat embraced by some who used it. And among their concerns were separation from impurity, strict following of the law, probably connected with the movement that was concerned to continue following the Jewish law even during time of persecution. And that group we find splitting after the Hasmoneans come to power. Another group that I'll mention a little later basically says, we can't support this, right? They don't have the right to be the priests or the kings. The Pharisees seem to be those who are willing to say, we don't approve of this either, but if we just, isolate ourselves and don't stay involved in society and governance and things like that, then, we're certainly not going to be listened to, right? And so trying to have an influence while disagreeing. Because there's so much interaction with Pharisees in the New Testament, it's often a misperception that they basically were in charge of Judaism in that time. And part of that misperception may also be due to the fact that what we think of as Pharisaic Judaism in Jesus' time does evolve into what later becomes Orthodox Judaism. But Josephus gives us a number of about 6,000 Pharisees in his time. If we consider them to be influential, and so there are people who might not have described themselves in this way but were influenced by these teachings, even so, even if we double, triple, quadruple that number, we're still not dealing with most Jews in this period, right? And so most Jews in this period have no denominational affiliation, if we want to use that terminology. Right. Two of the most famous individuals that connect with this movement are Hillel and Shammai. I won't say more about them because we're running out of time quickly, but two names that you can look up if you're interested in sort of the early roots of Rabbinic Judaism. But these are individuals who are older contemporaries of Jesus, and on some details, right, we see some interesting points of similarity or intersection. What did they teach? Right. Emphasis on oral law or tradition. And basically, probably the best analogy for that is if you think of the Torah, right, the Jewish law, as the constitution for Jews, right? It's the founding document. The oral law is basically the case law, the Supreme Court decisions, right? What legal experts have decided about how to apply it in new circumstances, what to do when two laws seem to be in tension with one another. One famous example is that gets mentioned in the New Testament. If you have the Sabbath, during which you're not supposed to work, and it falls on the 8th day from a child's birth, when you're supposed to circumcise the child, which takes precedence, the refraining from work or the circumcision of the child? And the rabbis decided circumcision takes precedent, right? It's legitimate to do that work on the Sabbath, right? Another emphasis of the tradition is to make a hedge around the Torah. You'll remember me explaining about the divine name, right? And people saying Lord, so to avoid And this is where that idea comes from, the idea of drawing the boundaries back just a little bit further to avoid people inadvertently actually offending against the law. Definition and clarification of the law. We get in later rabbinic sources a very large number of definitions as to, for instance, what constitutes work. Right? What is it appropriate to do on the Sabbath? What isn't it? Right? Diligence, but also lenience. For instance, when it comes to things like capital punishment, the rabbis found lots of loopholes to avoid capital punishment whenever it was possible to do so. And we get in later rabbinic sources, which may be continuing a tradition that goes back to the time of Jesus, but we get the sense that there's a conviction that if there's a loophole, God put that loophole there, and it's there to be used in creative ways. And a lot of focus is put on meals and purity. And what they seem to have been trying to do was to spread the purity that was required for the temple to meals in the home. And one reason for that might be that, in fact, the Pharisees were not calling the shots with respect to what went on in the temple in this period. And so trying to, as it were, take control of holiness in a domain that was under their control. Okay, Sadducees, right, closely associated with the priesthood, although not identical to it. Conservative and aristocratic. And for them, the ultimate authority was the Torah, which doesn't mean that they didn't have traditions, but rather like Protestants, right? At least in theory, the idea was, precedent and tradition is all well and good, but we should go back and check it against the Scripture. And they seem to have accepted the Torah alone as Scripture, or at the very least, didn't allow appeals to later books for matters of doctrine and halakha practice. Okay. And according to Josephus, did not believe in resurrection. We also get mention of that in the New Testament. And so, in this respect, more conservative. Right? We saw that it's really in the book of Daniel that we start to get the idea of resurrection. And so, didn't accept new ideas and supposedly emphasized free will. Okay, we've got 5 more minutes. I want to say a little bit about an institution that has been mentioned a few times, right? The temple. Right? The Sadducees were not simply the priests, but there seemed to have been at least some connections. And one possible origin for their name, right, which is connected with the Jewish word for righteous, but of course a name that comes from that word is Zadok, which was the name of the ancestor of the authorized line of priests. And so that may be the reason for that name. The temple no longer stands. There have been models made to try and give a sense of what it looked like and how it looked in comparison to the city. Right. The best way of giving you an impression of how big it was provided by a student in my Gospel of John class last semester. And she did this. And I just think that is wonderful. The dashed line reflects not the original location of the temple, lest anyone misunderstand, but reflects the size. And hopefully you can recognize that location and can figure out where you are. Would we be in the Holy of Holies? Sorry, no, never mind. Okay. This was not simply like, let's say a large cathedral or something like that. This was if you include the outer, the most, there's the inner courts, right? The Holy of Holies, the court of priests, court of Levites, the court of Israelites, right? Jewish men, the court of women, the court of Gentiles. Not quite concentric circles in how they were organized, but certainly expressing gradations of holiness. And this was a huge structure, right? That encompassed much more than just, the central sanctuary and place of worship. And that was, I think, very much symbolic of its importance in this time. Okay, we'll come back to any questions you have about any of these points next time. We've had opportunity to mention the Dead Sea Scrolls. And basically, we can talk about three categories, even though these categories don't necessarily reflect the way that those who produced them thought of them. These clearly were scrolls produced by a Jewish group. They're in Hebrew and Aramaic for the most part, and large, extensive copies of some parts of the Jewish scripture, still dealing with scrolls in this period, and so, as the name might indicate to you, and so, in fact, I'll leave the light on. You can see the images are not that clear. And so they had multiple copies of books that they read often and studied carefully. Others, they may have had only one copy, and in those cases, sometimes we only have fragments. And so they found fragments of, or copies of some sort of every book of the Hebrew Scriptures except Esther. And that may not indicate that they didn't like it or didn't read it, because in some cases there are only fragments. There was, in fact, a Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit that came to Indianapolis a few years ago, and I was very surprised because I thought, some of these scrolls, fragile. I mean, they're all fragile. They're not likely to move them. What they brought really were these sort of postage stamp-sized fragments. Right? And so, while we do have some complete or partially complete or mostly complete scrolls, there are a lot of fragments. Right? And so if you go to a Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit that's not at a major museum or something like that, prepare to see tiny little black things that you basically need the help of ultraviolet and infrared scanning to even make out the text on. This one is interesting just because, right, if you know recognize Hebrew script, you may notice something that doesn't look like Hebrew script in there occasionally. And in this particular manuscript, the divine name is written using the older Hebrew alphabet, which is an interesting feature of it. In addition to copies of Jewish scripture, we also have texts that were produced by this group. The group is usually thought to be the Essenes, mentioned by Josephus, not mentioned in the New Testament explicitly. And we have things like the Community Rule and the Damascus Document, which give us some indication of their beliefs, their emphases, their practices, and things of that sort. Here again, just to give you a sense of the state of some of these scrolls. One other thing that they provide that is extremely useful is that they provide commentary on parts of the Jewish scripture. And that's been particularly helpful in studying the New Testament because sometimes the way the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish scriptures, are interpreted in the New Testament can seem strange to modern readers. And we'll talk about examples of that. For instance, when we look at Matthew's quotations from some of the prophets and things like that. But when these were found in the middle of the 20th century, they provided for the first time the writings of an actual Jewish group from the time of the emergence of Christianity, other than Christianity, right? And so really has helped fill in the background and complement what we knew from other sources, and really has helped us to understand the New Testament in all sorts of ways that are too many to mention, not least because we are now out of time. But next time, we will be diving in to the New Testament. And in fact, the subject for next time is telling Jesus' story, the Gospel of Mark. Mark's Gospel is usually thought to be the earliest written, and we will be taking a look at it next time. Okay, you're free to go. Thanks, and have a good weekend.